few more seconds to connect with sound. We're very excited you're all here. Welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased you could join us this evening. My name is Sabrina Wesley Nero. I'm a teaching professor at Georgetown University, the co-director of the undergraduate program in Education, Inquiry, and Justice, known as EDIJ, and the assistant director of the graduate program in Educational Transformation, known as MAET. In addition to EDIJ and MAET, our event this evening is co-sponsored by Georgetown Center for Social Justice, Research, Teaching, and Service, where Dr. Andrea Whistler is the director. We want to acknowledge Dr. Whistler's leadership in coordinating this evening's event, even in her absence. And we thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, I want to offer a few ways that you can connect with our work and the work of these programs. If you are a Georgetown undergraduate student interested in community engaged courses, research and service, I encourage you to examine the resources and opportunities available through our Center for Social Justice, the CSJ. If you are a Georgetown undergraduate student in their first or second year and you're interested in the study of education and social justice, please check out the EDIJ course offerings for the spring 2023 semester and the application for the EDIJ minor that opens in February. If you're in your post-baccalaureate years and you're interested in pursuing graduate education and a career in education, take a look at our graduate program in Educational Transformation. MAET is a 12-month master's degree program for people interested in transforming education through advocacy and policy, and those interested in earning a teaching certification and master's degree to support educational transformation within schools by teaching English learners or multilingual students. Our application for the graduate program in Educational Transformation is now open, and the priority deadline for merit-based scholarship consideration is December 15th. In our work for education justice, we fight for equity with our eyes fixed upon those who are furthest away from opportunity. An intersectional lens allows us to see complexity and nuance in the examination of oppression and in our recognition of resilience, strength, and solidarity. Our fight is not exclusively on the behalf of a single identity. We don't live single lives. Our guest today will offer us the chance to explore the implications and richness of deaf culture, and by leaning into a broader exploration that is simultaneously nuanced, I hope that we learn to be open to new ideas and perspectives, redefine obstacles, and reimagining possibilities. We are joined this evening by Dr. Erin Moriarty and Dr. Ted Supalla. Erin Moriarty is the assistant professor in graduate program in the graduate program in Deaf Studies at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., and an honorary research fellow at Harrowwatt University in Edinburgh, United Kingdom. Her research interests include linguistic ethnography, translanguaging, language ideologies, deaf mobilities, the deaf ecosystem, affect and the senses, and moral orientations. Her recent articles include Deaf Cosmopolitanism, Calibrating as a Moral Process with Annalise Custers, Filmmaking in a Linguistic Ethnography of Deaf Tourist Encounters, and Signed to Me, Not to the Children, Ideologies of Language Contamination at Deaf Tourist Site in Bali, as well as an ethnographic film, #Deaf Travel, Deaf Tourism in Bali. Dr. Moriarty is wrapping up a 5-year European Research Council funded project on deaf tourism and recently received an award from the NEH to reimagine deaf studies for the future. Dr. Ted Supalla is a professor of neurology, linguistics, and psychology at Georgetown University and the director of the Sign Language Research Lab. His lab hosts a historical sign language database as a resource tool for public use. Currently, he is constructing the early grammar of American Sign Language and its literary traditions through a structural analysis of ASL as recorded on historical films. He is a co-author of Sign Language Archaeology, Understanding Historical Roots of American Sign Language. We will first hear from Dr. Moriarty, and then we will examine work by Dr. Supalla. At the end of our time, we will have a Q&A session with the audience. Help me welcome Dr. Moriarty.
What a lovely welcome. I really appreciate that, and I am happy to be here. Let me first take a moment to share my slides. All right. Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. So I'm here to talk about the project that I've been working with the deaf mobility. And my presentation is Calibration as Equity and Justice in Language Practices. This project is based on data that I collected in Bali, Indonesia for 7 months. And first, I'm going to provide some context for this research. My PhD is in anthropology from American University, and my PhD dissertation is about languaging and deaf culture in Cambodia. So basically, what happened was that several NGOs went into Cambodia, and they essentially said, there's no sign language here. There's no indigenous sign language present. So they brought in American Sign Language. That set the stage for my research. Cambodia is not the only place where this happens. Gallaudet University, based here in Washington, D.C., is really the only place where deaf education happens on a collegiate level. And oftentimes, international people will come to Gallaudet, graduate, and go back home. And in the past, there didn't seem to be a good understanding of the importance of language preservation. So oftentimes you would see missions, deaf educators, and other people who worked with the Peace Corps going into different countries and disseminating and bringing ASL into those countries. So American Sign Language has a large presence and dominance in the world in the past since the 1950s. So that's some context that I wanted to provide for this presentation. You know, many countries have ASL or a language that's been influenced by ASL. Guyana, Nigeria, Trinidad and Tobago, Philippines, Cambodia, and many, many other countries, really too many to name them all in this presentation, for the fact that people who are traveling to those countries start to educate and the technology of and the techniques of deaf education, the total communication approach. And for that reason, many countries' national sign language is being influenced by American Sign Language. And to be quite frank, ASL is one of the most well-documented languages and one of the most languages with the most resources. It has sign language books, it has videos, and it's widely available online. So with that, a lot of people learn American Sign Language as their second or third language. And because of its widespread dissemination, ASL has become the lingua franca in many different areas. There's also international sign. So international sign is something that's a little bit hard to define because it's not a conventionalized for the most part globally. IS is used in international deaf spaces like the World Federation of the Deaf Conference, deaf youth convening for parties or what have you in Europe, or anytime a deaf person meets another deaf person and they use different signed languages, you will find that those individuals will either code switch or use IS to communicate. There's a lot of resistance to American Sign Language in international spaces, particularly the Global South and in Europe, because of the relationship with the linguistic imperialism. And so there is a notion that people who use ASL, they sign too fast, they fingerspell too quickly, and it's tough to understand. So there is that tension between people who use American Sign Language in international context because everybody knows it, so to speak. And at the same time, an internal resistance to this linguistic imperialism that happens. So part of the framework for my research, now I'm actually reverting to IS right now, but the cosmopolitan theory states that people who are world travelers, tour guides, people who are shop vendors in large cities, essentially aren't necessarily viewing themselves as culturally superior, but more as being open-minded and wanting to accommodate to the other language user. So people who are participating in cosmopolitanism is seeking out trying to find that common ground. They'll do things like code switch. Personally, I don't use that term as, in terms of my research, but for simplicity's sake, we'll talk about code switching in this context, but they will do things like code switch, and they will internalize a degree of empathy. So my data points out that language is center to cosmopolitanism as a practice. So my research project looks at corner shop cosmopolitanism. So how does a deaf signer communicate with a hearing non-signer? Deaf people who are vendors, who are ordering food, who are providing or receiving services. So for example, here in DC, we have a signing Starbucks. We also have deaf-owned restaurants, one being Mazzeria. There are others. There's a deaf brewery that's nearby, Streetcar 82. So Streetcar 82 is really particularly interesting because the owner is deaf and does not use technology to help facilitate communication with customers. He essentially forces his customers and his staff to write back and forth, to gesture, or any other type of communication strategy that does not rely on technology to make communication happen. So my research includes different strategies that deaf people, deaf signers use to communicate. Gesturing, signing, mouthing, trying to speak, writing in different languages. Indonesian English, American Sign Language, Bisindo, Auslan, and the like. Deaf people who are signers really have intrinsically developed this calibration toolkit. And that allows for those encounters to be successful, even when the person that they're talking to does not speak the same language or is a non-signer. So they're essentially open to different modalities of communication, and they're willing to explore those different types of communication strategies. So there's different types of linguistic cosmopolitanism. In international context, people will use the lingua franca like English, American Sign Language, or what have you. But then the question becomes, is that true cosmopolitanism? Because this is the dominant language that is used in that particular space. There's also another interesting example, the Esperanto, which is essentially creating a linguistic middle ground. So they're creating a language that nobody is actually using. So they're not using the lingua franca, and they're not using anyone's native language. Another example is that there are plural monolingualism. So a person will learn to use each other's language, or they'll bring in an interpreter. Like at the World Federation of the Deaf Conference, they will bring in various interpreters to help facilitate communication. But the question becomes, is that cosmopolitanism? Because that's the way that they're communicating. And then third is translanguaging. I work with this theory a lot, which is essentially the mixing bits and pieces of languages and other semiotic resources. So that shows more of that cosmopolitanism. The example that I shared earlier, using international sign, is one of them. There's a recent article that was published that I was an author in talking about deaf cosmopolitanism. So the idea is that deaf people have the skill to be able to connect across national linguistic borders with other deaf people based on their calibration skills. So they can cross linguistic borders. And this also is based on this deaf same trope. Now, when we analyzed deaf cosmopolitanism, we weren't suggesting that this was the right or correct way to do that, because there are some problems with this concept. One being is that not everyone is coming into that context with the same background and the same access to American Sign Language or another prevalent language like English, for example. And so deaf people who can travel, who can backpack and go on holiday, it has a different kind of privilege as compared to someone who cannot leave Indonesia, for example, because they cannot get a visa to enter into a different country. So there is a wide variety of privilege in terms of tourism, travel, and access to language. So this deaf same trope often is something that deaf people will say. Oh, we can understand each other because we're both the same. But that sort of obscures the underlying power dynamics that are actually at play. So, what did we realize through our work with my research team, Mobile Deaf? What we realized is that we see how language is center to cosmopolitanism as a practice. But there are a few scholars that really focus on the language rather than other types of practices of not necessarily calibration, but being open to differences. There are few that are actually looking at the language piece of cosmopolitanism. So my data. As I mentioned earlier, my data was focused on tourist mobility. I did 7 months of field work in Bali, Indonesia. And I am very lucky that many of the deaf tourists sort of let me tag along for their holiday, just being the nosy anthropologist that I am, making lots of documentation about what they were doing. And a lot of deaf people were traveling through Bali. So Bali has 2 deaf guides there. One is from France, and their name is Gio, and the other is Wayu, who is an Indonesian from Indonesia. So because of their different backgrounds, they both have different approaches to tourism. And I unfortunately don't have time to go into detail about that tonight, but my film is available online for free. Anyone can watch it. There are closed captions available in English, and there's also Indonesian subtitles available as well. So with that 7 months of field work, myself and the other members of my research team noticed that oftentimes deaf people will talk about that calibration or that switching or exchanging amongst other people. And we realized that that is a very deaf metaphor. So deaf people often talk about calibrating or trying to meet in the middle with hearing people who don't sign, with deaf signers who use a different signed language. And that act of calibration and aligning is central to deaf cosmopolitanism and languaging practices. So this was during COVID, so I wasn't able to get pictures of Wagyu, but the metaphors used to describe deaf languaging practices is these signs that you see pictures of right here. So what do I mean when I talk about calibrating? Essentially, it's the use of diverse semiotic resources, international signing, mouthing, writing, finger spelling, and all in different languages, Bisendo, all types of different languages and different hand shapes. So as people in international context calibrate, they will also adopt new resources very rapidly through rapid language learning. And so they are learning as they're communicating and start to use new language features. And I'm sure that this is all very abstract right now, but I will show you some examples from my film footage so that you can see what I mean by that. And then we can analyze those examples. So this is an example of calibrating. Wagyu, the deaf tour guide in Indonesia, is working with a group that includes deaf people from Italy, India, and Australia. So that group is essentially random people who have come together and want to schedule a tour with this guide. They all use different sign languages and come from different language backgrounds. So you can see how Wagyu shows this cosmopolitan behavior and practices by calibrating to each person and their different language background, and also doing some language brokering. So I'm just going to need a second to find the clip. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. All right. Hopefully you were able to see a bit of the footage. I'm not sure what the streaming looks like for everyone, but again, it is available online and you're welcome to view it. So I took some stills of this moment by moment interaction so that you could see how Wagyu would sign. The example that I'm using here is a sign for belief. And then in the film, Henna says, "What does that mean?" Then Wagyu repeats it, knowing that they are from Australia. And so everyone sort of repeats the sign that they have now learned. And then Henna comes and asks a woman from Italy, "Well, what's your sign for belief?" And the woman obviously wasn't following the conversation completely and was like, "What is this sign? What are you asking?" And so then you could see how that exchange, like there's 4 people involved in this exchange. They're all working together to calibrate to each other to make sure that communication happens, which I think is quite fascinating. It's a really interesting practice. I'm not sure if I have enough time to show you the entirety of the second clip, but I'll show you a portion of it. All right. Okay, so I wish I could show you the entire movie. I mean, there's so many fascinating layers as it pertains to privilege and some of the ideologies and attitudes. They're just really interesting to see what people say. And I think this clip is a very clear example of the power dynamics at play and who has specific ideologies about other people and their sign language and their level of access. So, for example, the Ronja is the woman who didn't have a sign name in the very beginning of the clip. She grew up oral, so she didn't really have any contact with deaf people until she went on this tour. And so this tour group was with Geo, the other deaf guide. And that group had two Germans, an American, someone from London, I think, Belgium, and two people from Belgium. So a real mix of different sign languages that were present. And so when they were meeting with the local deaf Indonesians, you could see these language exchanges happening. So you could see how Career is this gentleman. He mentions that he's from the UK and uses BSL, and the finger spelling of British Sign Language is very similar to Basendo's finger spelled modality. So, like the letter B, for example. You also saw a part in the clip where people would compare signs and then try to connect, would say things like, oh, you sign like this. This is similar to how I would do it in our language. There was one guy from Germany who was trying to figure out where another island, the island of Lombok, was, which is very close to Bali. And he was struggling to try to figure out how to get that across. Then the deaf woman got what he was trying to say and then was able to explain where in geographically where it was. And so that language exchange happened because then she taught him the sign for Lombok. And so he was able to gain that new resource. This conversation, something similar happened. There was a group of two women from Germany and a gentleman from Bali. You could see how they were trying to make themselves understood by using objects. I use this as an example of multimodal translanguaging. So this is where people have reached a communication barrier. They will start to point to objects. And so they pointed to this bottle of water, right? So they pointed to the water on the table and then used that to teach the sign for water in their respective languages. And then they were able to exchange that educational moment. And I don't know if you caught this part, but this has been one of my challenges with this film is how to show the wide variety of language resources that are being involved in one particular situation. So there was one woman who was mouthing in German, signing in IS, an international sign, and there was a mashup of different resources. And then you could see how the gentleman from Bali started to fingerspell in Indonesian Sign Language and then realized they don't know Indonesian fingerspelling. And then he sort of like swatted his hand and then went to international fingerspelling. And then later on, he said, I don't know IS. I never meet international deaf people, which is in direct conflict because he's in a situation and he's using IS right here in this footage. So that was just really interesting. I'm out of time, so I'm going to wrap up. And what I want to leave you with is how international sign language is part of calibration and using that in an iconic and transparent fashion, incorporation of signs from different sign languages, repetition, duplication, paraphrasing, and translanguaging are all examples of that multimodal calibration. And that ties into this cosmopolitanism because there's a moral orientation and affect entanglement and the willingness and the motivation to make understanding happen. And so people really do invest a lot of time in connecting across language boundaries and really trying to work towards communication and work towards a shared understanding. And that is a crucial part of the international deaf experience, I feel. And also, I think that there's oftentimes when people in a particular group who may not fully understand everything 100% of the time, but they're okay with it. They sort of accept that as part of the experience. So calibration and international sign calibration is a moral practice. So there's a particular ideology about using certain signs or sign languages that shape deaf languaging practices. And there's a strong moral concern around what resources are appropriate to use in which settings and locations. And so I didn't show you one particular clip about American Sign Language. So there's often a situation where people will try to avoid using American Sign Language and end up doing this really sort of convoluted gesturing theatrical presentation because they don't want to appear as the oppressor. So that visual representation and expansive signing is more inclusive than ASL, and then sometimes and oftentimes is fingerspelling. Fingerspelling is often not accessible. So translanguaging is viewed as good practice. So deaf cosmopolitanism, the affect and practical calibration that happens, is the feeling of deaf same, wanting to make sure that everyone in the space is understanding each other and we're all sharing a language together and sharing that deaf experience and having empathy, being open to differences and incorporating and knowing that calibration has to happen in order to create a quote unquote equal footing. But then again, we all know that that's never truly what's going to happen. But it is interesting how many people have that intrinsic belief and do so in that practice of translanguaging. So in conclusion, deaf languaging practices, particularly calibrating, is language ideologies that include moral ideas about clear deaf communication and what that means. And so which bits of semiotic repertoires are available and in which context? Like the guy who started fingerspelling in Basindo and then swatted his hand and then moved to IS fingerspelling. Also that tension between the ASL, the respect for like ASL imperialism and the need of communication. There's also a strong opinions about respecting the country's sign language when one travels. People also have a strong opinion about mouthing and fingerspelling, which means essentially that you're bringing in the spoken language element into the conversation, like the one woman in German who kept mouthing in German, and her friend who is more, I guess, aware said, hey, stop doing that. Because, and that's another important piece of this, because English is also a bridge for comprehension in international settings. And so it's not just about the signing, but it's also about the movement of the mouth, the mouthing, and English as a lingua franca. So you can see how people and their semiotic repertoires all are infused with morality. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Moriarty. I can imagine that our students and audience members are wrestling with some of the shared strands around your work and the lens your work brings to us, particularly around languaging, translanguaging, ideologies, and power dynamics. So we really appreciate that. And as you all are thinking about your questions for Dr. Moriarty, I encourage you to document those. You can put them in the chat to Anne, and we will return to that at our Q&A session toward the end. Next, we welcome Dr. Ted Supalla to learn more about his work.
Thank you, Sabrina. It's very much, and I enjoyed Erin's presentation very much. And transitioning into my part, it may seem like I'm coming from an opposite perspective. It's wonderful to see young adults, deaf adults, and some older folks as well, being together and social aspects out there in the world. That those discoveries about themselves as deaf people and other people around that concept of deaf same and how that is, that can be mind-blowing for some people. When looking at that, it reminded me of some previous experiences as well. Growing up here in America, in the United States, was a very, very different experience. So I want to introduce and give a little context about a film that I made. I'm going to show you that video. But why I chose to do it the way that I did it, I've reasoning behind that I wanted to share with you. It's the viability of ASL as a heritage language. And that relates to intersectionality. All the identities that we have. So looking at all of these young adults, they are free to travel all over the world. It's very exciting experiences that they're encountering in their travels, and that intersectionality is even made more clear in those videos. That's what we saw from Dr. Moriarty's talk. And looking to American Sign Language, I view it as a heritage language. And that frame is becoming more prevalent now. It is, and my belief is that it is because of what has been happening in American society as a larger context. And I will talk more about that in the video. When I present this video, I made it with a particular challenge in mind. That the video, the audience I'm thinking of, I presented it a month ago. And those audience members had people that were blind and deaf-blind in the audience. So I had to adapt how I was presenting the information, thinking of all the intersectionalities of the people in the audience I was presenting to. What they asked me to present about and what they heard about the idea of American Sign Language as a heritage language, they wanted to understand more about that, especially the blind people, because they cannot see sign language. But there is history behind that. And so I had the opportunity to then think about, okay, so if I want to really make this accessible, and talking about heritage language, how do I do that in a way that's accessible in terms of the timing, how the timing is right, how you frame it. And so I'm leaving that as an introduction. The film is 38 minutes in length. At the end, I'm happy to comment and particularly interested in how you see it engaging with your work and with Erin's as well.
Hello. I was invited to talk about understanding ASL as a heritage language. I'll explain exactly what that means first. Contemporary American Sign Language, what I'm using now, is not a series of ad hoc gestures or creations. It's a language that has existed for generations, which is why I specify heritage in the title. Now today, you've likely seen old films documenting sign language, like the one shown here. This film is often described as a model of beautiful language, but a challenge for you to consider is that the theme of that film is the preservation of sign language, because it was under threat even 100 years ago. The lecturer was George Beditz. He was an educator by profession, but was also active in the fight for the right to use signs. I'll discuss his concerns, but I want to point out that he wasn't the only one. I've included a panoramic photo of the NAD members who raised funds to make the film series. That's right, there are more films of lectures in sign language. But the Beditz film garners a lot of attention because his topic is so important, the preservation of sign language. So this was not just an individual stewardship effort, it was a collective effort among the deaf community. And it wasn't a one-off project either. It was one part of a continuous effort that has lasted to the present day, which begs the question, why do we have to fight for this right? Here's a roadmap of my talk to help everyone follow along. But first, I should introduce myself. I'm a researcher. I'm deaf. My name is Ted Supalla, and to say my name in ASL, tuck your thumb under your index finger and tap it twice on your chin. Now I'd like to address how I plan to give today's talk. I know that some in the audience are blind, so I've tried to sequence my slides carefully. Wherever I have text, I plan to point and allow enough time for each of you to read it. I might have a single line of text or multiple. Where I have multiple, I'll read them all, then reread each one as I discuss it. I'll do the same thing with images, allowing enough time for interpreters so that blind and deafblind people can access them. I hope it all works. This presentation is multimedia in that I'm giving the presentation in ASL. It was translated and voiced over, and captions were added. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. Now I'll point to the first subheading and pause for the interpreter to read it aloud. Even during cycles of neglect or oppression by the larger hearing society, we continue to nourish and steward its journey. I'd like to draw your attention to the terms neglect and oppression. In the context of broader hearing society, which is largely non-signing, we face the challenge of always having to explain why we need to use ASL. If we don't do this, we run the risk of being ignored or forgotten, and we may be seen as different or even stamped out. This is what has happened repeatedly over time. Now we know from these experiences that we have to plan for how to preserve our language and nourish it. We are and always have been responsible for its stewardship. Here's the next point. To ensure strong, everlasting stewardship, we need to better understand our history of struggles and competing ideas. What's important here is that this has been done by trial and error with some successes, so we need to make a good plan. We also need to explain ourselves in a way that doesn't oversimplify the issues. They are multifaceted, and even we need to know this history. Moreover, we need to know the context of these historic struggles with hearing society when they've made decisions that adversely impact us or when they create alternative solutions. Secondly, the competing ideas are those different approaches I just mentioned. When hearing society has different notions about us, we have to keep explaining ourselves to correct and solve the issues that they create. I'll let you read the title first. Before digging into its history, we must first know who uses ASL to fully understand how it is used. I'll discuss the distinction between fluent ASL users and those in the community who are not. I'll also talk about how signed language is used and learned, as it's not just intuition or invention. On to the first point about the who. Fundamental demographics of the deaf community. The majority of children born to deaf adults are hearing. So to clarify, deaf people do not always have deaf children. In fact, most have hearing children. Deaf parents sign to their hearing children and they acquire the language, so they're also a part of the deaf community. They're referred to as codas. The recent movie by the same name has helped spread awareness that deaf people don't live in isolation. We get married and we have children too. Next, I'll talk about some proportions. Census records refuted fear about threat of deaf race. There was a growing concern that deaf adults would intermarry, have deaf children, and create a deaf race, which is now known to not be true, but this was a very real fear 100 years ago. Proponents of the idea cautioned people that a deaf race could exist. I'll discuss what was behind that belief, but for now, the point is that the fear existed because people didn't know what it would mean for deaf people to have children. Only 5% of deaf adults have deaf children. And among deaf children, only 5% are from deaf families. The remaining 95% are from hearing families and are born deaf because of illness or genetics. Hearing people often don't know when they're carriers, although there is more awareness now. Going back to the point about fears of the threat of a deaf race, what was that based on? The fact that deaf adults sign and a fear that their children would learn and use signs, which might lead to a desire to live as a separate signing community that could grow unchecked. I'll describe some of the plans and actions taken to prevent this from happening, but the point I'd like to make is again that deaf people are not always born into homes in which they would even acquire sign language to begin with. Let's start by looking at differences in language exposure. In general, one must be surrounded by a community of language users to learn or acquire that language. But today, we're talking about Helen Keller's legacy. So I'll point out that she did not grow up as a signer. No members of her family used ASL or signed at all, but they did hire a teacher to communicate with her through fingerspelling only. Her age is also important. Helen could initially hear and speak, as she was born hearing, but at 1.5, she became deaf and blind due to an illness. Now, suddenly being deaf-blind, what did the family do? Interestingly, Helen later recalls having used home signs with her parents and other relatives to express her needs. What exactly are home signs? I'll describe that now. Several case studies now show that when a deaf person is born into a hearing family, they create their own home sign systems. They may draw on gestures that they see used in the environment around them and add to them because they have to express their needs. They continue building on these signs and end up being better at using them than their own parents. This has been shown among young deaf children, but what happens if a child grows up with only hearing non-signers and continues to use home signs? There are case studies of adults in this situation. I've met one such person, and I'll show you an example of what their signs are like. Here's an image of a multi-sign construction for snake. It's made up of two signs: a flexed index finger moving forward, which means to strike, like this, followed by this sign, meaning to slither. The index finger is now extended, and this sign has a different movement. It goes side to side, like this. The pairing of both signs is needed to satisfy the intent, maybe because when they were younger, people didn't clearly understand if they only used one of the signs, but adding the second one clarified the meaning. Their interactive experiences were only with hearing non-signers, but they could depend on visual cues to be understood. Maybe this ability to tap into the human capacity for gesture is what home signers use as the basis to build a language, even into adulthood. I should add that this adult home signer never went to school. They live on a remote island, and the images on the slide are recreations of signs that we captured as part of our study. Now I'll discuss what it's like when a deaf child has a signing family. The key difference is that in this case, the deaf child is surrounded by an accessible language. They can see people in their environment signing. The child will start signing and continue signing into adulthood. There's ample documentation of this from the past 20, 30 years, but for confidentiality reasons, footage can't be shown publicly. The footage is always coded, and only the data is shared. So, I'll show you footage of my own home movies as examples. I've pulled 3 freeze frames from the films, and I have them displayed on the left side of the screen. In the middle of each image is a father and mother, flanked by 2 children. The child on the left is older and sitting on the father's lap. He's a boy, and his baby brother is seated across from him on the mother's lap. This is my family, and I'm the baby in the picture. I was 1 year old at the time. Now, I'll discuss how the family uses their eyes when communicating with each other. I'll point out the relevant parts of each image in order starting at the top with the same picture that I just described. Look at each person's hands and eyes. The mother's hand is on the baby's belly, like this. The reason for this is to get his attention. Touch is required for getting attention. The father and brother are also looking in that direction because, as one would expect in a family, they're looking to see what the baby will do. So the eyes are important. That's why we're considered a visual people. Now let's look at the next image. 3 arrows now appear over the eyes and hands. The father and brother are now looking elsewhere because the mother is now pointing to a location off camera. Obviously, the family is going to look to where somebody is pointing, and that's what happened here. Now they're all looking off camera, but the baby is not yet. He's still excited and waving his hands. What about, I don't know or remember. But let's see what happens in the next image. In the third image, everyone's eyes are on the baby again. I'll point out where the father and brother are looking with line of sight arrows. Apparently they knew that the baby was still otherwise occupied. But the mom knew to give him a second. And at that point, he does look to where she had been pointing, shown here. This confirms that the baby understood what was happening and the use of space. That indicated that he was ready for visual communication. The family would wait. Rather than using a barrage of vocabulary when a kid isn't looking, they followed my milestones, which is the same as what's done with spoken languages. Adults don't use language that's too advanced for children. We use age-appropriate language, and we see that here with a 1-year-old. Next, I'd like to show clips from another home movie. We have a bunch of home movies that I inherited. I'm 5 in this one. I'm alone in the clip, but I seem to have learned how to direct my family. My dad is behind the camera filming and seems to have been interested in how I'd communicate. There will be me seated in the center of the shot, and you'll see another boy come in, my younger brother. Watch for how he communicates with me. Again, this involves contact because he apparently needs to tell me something, and then he goes off camera again. In the clip, I'm signing to the camera, and it seems I knew I was being recorded and that we would watch the movie later at the next family movie night. Here it is. Oh, before I hit play, I want to point out that gloss translations are available below the video. These are the meanings of each sign that I use when I'm talking to the camera. The words are have, tractor, wagon, and house. Now I'll play the clip. This one shows more complex family dynamics. Lots of hand movement, some attention getting, plus I'm talking to the camera, or getting my father's attention, so that he'd be ready to record me while I talked about what I got for Christmas. Christmas in general is a great time for families' home movies, and this is one example of that, as was the film that was made when I was a year old. Next on our roadmap is the topic of raising awareness about the history of ASL and its status as a true language. The slide is entitled Everlasting Challenge, Promoting Status of Sign Language. Gauging the status of sign languages should not only be comparisons to spoken languages, but assessments of each language and their own heritages. That means each language community's ideas have to be respected and their rules followed. What's happened historically is that non-signers often suppressed signing based on their fears. Now, sign language legacies are prone to fragmentation because communities are divided along competing ideas about signing and speaking, or doing what broader society wants. That harms us because A, stakeholders are pitted versus language policy in society. In other words, real people with shared desires, stakeholders, are isolated and, facing obstacles, seek out like-minded people, then decide to do something, which leads to solidarity. This has always been the case. Just like in Beddits' time, he and a community of stakeholders faced this a century ago. And it still happens today because of broader social policies. Policies that are intended to replace what deaf communities use with various methods of communication. The onus is constantly on us then to try to follow these policies only to fail. Is it all an experiment? Or do they really want us to be like them? That challenge is summed up in point B, policy driven by, quote, restoring the deaf to society. Because society's definition of a normal person is someone who speaks, they want deaf people to speak as well. Hearing parents may want their deaf children to speak just like they do. Their fears are assuaged by those who say that they have a plan for how deaf children can be successfully restored to society. Here's one example of that from when I was young, in 1967. I was about 15 at the time, and a nearby school made a film and distributed it to parents as a way to show what was expected of their children's behavior. Teachers were involved in the making of the film as well, and recorded students' performance. The title of the film was Social Graces in School, and it was made by the Parent-Teacher Association of the California School for the Deaf at Riverside. Several people brought this film to my attention. Unfortunately, I can't show it here, but I'll describe it to you. Students were sorted into two groups, given separate instructions, and filmed separately. One group was labeled as having bad behavior, and as it turns out, they were using language that looks the same as how we sign today. They were using ASL. I reflected on my own upbringing and thought about how many times I was told not to sign the way I normally did, and instead to behave properly, which is exactly what was shown in the film's good behavior group. They communicated by fingerspelling only. Why was that? You have to look at when the film was made. At the time, Helen Keller was the only model people could turn to. She not only spoke, she used the manual alphabet. So when schools and parents needed a visual form of communication, they would follow what Helen Keller did. Parents who wanted to improve communication with their adolescent children were encouraged to use fingerspelling as a solution. Now, the challenge we have to consider is that as the children who were taught this way got older, they had been conditioned to believe that society would only tolerate the use of fingerspelling. Now I'll discuss common concerns among stakeholders. What is it that broader society really wants? Deaf people are evaluated as being successful models or failures according to societal standards of behavior, speaking ability, or their command of the grammar of the dominant language, English. And if deaf people want to use different codes, writing is allowed, speaking is allowed, and fingerspelling is allowed. Now being limited to those three options, deaf children can succeed in the dominant language. But this poses a challenge to those of us whose native language is not English. What about those who already have a visual language? The first challenge is how to restore the legacy of sign language. We have to educate society that there are large numbers of people, not only in the US but worldwide, who use sign languages but are being denied the right to use them. That means we have to safeguard sign language heritage, because if sign languages can't be passed on to deaf children, they'll be deprived of language, which we absolutely cannot let happen. These efforts are already underway and have reached the level of the United Nations, which has declared that deaf children have the right to learn signed languages. How do we ensure that these international successes apply at the local level as well? And how do we ensure sustainability and quality assurance? When ASL stakeholders try to insist on quality assurance, there's confusion regarding claims of authority. I'll show you a few examples that have posed real challenges for us. The first one is the fake interpreter at the Nelson Mandela Memorial. How could there be a fake interpreter at the memorial for someone as prominent as Nelson Mandela, a real hero of South Africa? His death was an international event, and his funeral was attended by world leaders and dignitaries. So it was remarkable that they dedicated space for an interpreter. However, deaf people from all over the world could tell that something was off. If you don't sign, you might not be able to tell why this looks different from real signed languages. But signers had plenty of reasons to be skeptical. I'll show you a clip. The amount of repetition was unusual. But what could someone do in that moment? Replace the person on stage so publicly? No. So he stayed there throughout the entire ceremony. Of course, deaf people were upset and questioned the interpretation, only to find out that this person was schizophrenic and believed he knew a signed language. Apparently, the event organizers took him at his word with no verification and hired him. This was appalling to the deaf community that we would still have such problems with quality assurance of interpreters at such a high-profile event. Here's the next example. How can we show people who hire interpreters that we already have ways of vetting fluency? Some say that interpreters should take classes, but government officials make the hiring decisions and believe people who claim they're fluent enough to interpret. This creates a real challenge for the deaf community, as we also have to fight for the right to assess interpreters. This problem still isn't resolved, but I bring this up as a reminder to look to the past for their solutions to quality assurance. I looked into this and found that in 18th and 19th century Europe, literary societies existed at deaf schools and clubs for teenagers and young adults to compete in demonstrating their oratory skills in sign languages. These expositions were well attended, and some presenters were celebrated while others were encouraged to keep practicing in order to reach higher levels. What happened to these competitions? They no longer existed in the 20th century. The time that literary societies ceased to exist marks what I call the dark period for signers. While some considered starting our history anew, I suggest we look back beyond that period to shed light on the time when our history was suppressed. Illuminating the dark period doesn't require guesswork or starting over. We can reconstruct what was practiced in the more distant past. To do this, we have to take an archaeological approach, which was the basis of my book with Patricia Clark. We decided to call it Sign Language Archaeology because people largely only know contemporary histories of ASL, but aren't aware that there's much more to be uncovered. I'll share some of our discoveries. We organized what we found into a timeline and marked each era by well-known figures associated with each time period, as shown here. de la Paix, Clare, and Vedets. De la Paix founded the School for the Deaf in Paris. When Americans wanted to start a school, they brought over a French deaf teacher named Laurent Clair. But that's the extent of the history that we're told. The Vedets film was only found relatively recently, having been largely abandoned and collecting dust. It can now take its rightful place as a new chapter in our history. Where are these histories primarily kept? Not much is written, but we found films and sign language dictionaries that contain more information than we had realized. The books predate the dark period and helped us better understand our history. Going back to the first image of de la Paix, look closely at the bottom right corner. The image is dated 1760, which is the same year the school opened, marking the beginning of LSF. In his film, Vedets credits de la Paix as the inventor of our signs, but as I will show, that wasn't the case. What often happens is that deaf people who join the community later in life take these stories as truth, and, seeing the same names mentioned over and over, come to believe that the language was invented. But if you take another look at the picture of de la Paix and recall the story of the expansion of the French method, he had met two deaf sisters. We can infer that that is who is pictured here with him. He's watching them, and they understood each other. But nobody had taught them those signs. They must have been using a home sign system. They provided evidence that deaf people could be skilled language users and could communicate their ideas, which is why de la Paix knew it was worth starting a school where people would sign. Americans had heard about this school and also accepted the idea, which is why they undertook the same policy and plans as the French, largely importing their same approach. Along with that model, they had help not from instructional materials, but from Laurent Clair. That one school paved the way for others around the country. There's a wealth of documentation linking American Sign Language to LSF. At that time, LSF was still in use, of course, so ASL and LSF continued on their own parallel evolutionary courses and are no longer the same because they changed independently. If an ASL user and an LSF user were to meet today, they wouldn't understand each other. We plan to do more research, building backwards from 1817, extending beyond 1760. There are old books in French with illustrations that we'll rely on, which leads to my next point: making historical sign language materials accessible. I wanted to build something to make these historical materials readily available. So, I built a database to serve as a repository of films and images. It's hosted here at Georgetown University and is publicly accessible. We don't have all the materials there yet, we're still working on it, but here are some examples of what's there. Pictures from dictionaries, with text from the dictionary entries below each image. Now, the films didn't come with translations, so we used dictionaries to verify our interpretations of the archaic signs used from 1910 to 1920. These films fill a gap between books that were published before and after that decade, allowing us to study continuous historical changes that validate ASL as a heritage language. What's unique about heritage languages is that they aren't invented by an individual. They're the result of a community coming together and building a language and history that eventually becomes a way of life. How do we do that now in order to empower collaboration for introducing this unique heritage to children and parents, thus enlightening society. By building a resource that hearing parents can turn to when facing questions about how to raise their deaf children. If they knew this history, they could imagine how their child would take part in this legacy. It can also serve as a response to larger society's demands for proof about signed languages. The fundamental message is that data exists that proves that the formation of sign language through time is just like the formation of other languages of the world. That's the point I hope you take away. To conclude, I'd like to thank my many collaborators, research participants, and funders. This work was done with grant support from NSF Grants BCS 09-25073 and BCS 14-55-756. A second set of grants comes from NIH and NEH fellowships. I'd like to thank my research team at Georgetown University for their support. I'd also like to acknowledge school and university archivists for the information and materials that are currently scattered around the country. School librarians and archivists are wonderful custodians of these long-neglected historical artifacts. Finally, I'd like to thank my dear friend, co-author, and archaeological collaborator, Patricia Clark. I'd also like to announce a forthcoming book with Matthew Malskoon entitled Home Movies, Hardly Silent, which discusses home movies that feature sign language. We're anticipating a 2023 publication date. The value of home movies relates to what I mentioned earlier. Families made films without the expectation that they'd be used as data. So we want to encourage people to preserve and pass down their home movies because they're a part of our history.
Thank you, Dr. Supalla. So
Can you spotlight the other interpreter, Patricia?
And can we add another spotlight? I want to pause right now to see if Dr. Moriarty or Dr. Supalla want to add any comments to their presentation before we go to the Q&A.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that really struck me during your presentation, Ted, is that tension between ASL being endangered in the US and in quote unquote hearing society, while at the same time also having a lot of a dominance in the international spaces. And so it really is sort of dependent. I guess the power dynamics often will shift, is really the point here.
Agreed. Also, it brings to mind the idea, thinking about deaf people on an international scale. 200 years ago, Laurent Clerc, a deaf Frenchman, moved to America. Can you imagine that? And things exploded because of that. A new place to to come to that was unfamiliar, and then seeing how ASL has now been brought in an imperialist fashion all over the world. I can imagine Claire was signing French Sign Language. And so America, did they see it as a complex system in all of the rights that a language is, or not? What makes one language have more influence than another? Really, American Sign Language started with, French Sign Language, actually.
Yeah. Also, one of the things that I also wanted to point out as well is in regards to the history of deaf education in general, and how often language or communication methods become a technique. Excuse me, that was interpreter error. It becomes a technology of the deaf community. So when I'm talking about ASL being dispersed globally, part of that happens because of a woman who traveled all over the world with the Peace Corps and spread the philosophy of total communication as a part of that. And so total communication is not necessarily intended as a methodology, but more of a philosophy, but to expose deaf children to everything, signing, spoken language, and a written language. But how that idea took root in other countries allowed it to shift and become a methodology. And so I think that's a fascinating piece of deaf education, about how deaf people have tried to solve the problem of literacy in deaf education. And so trying to fix that through different methodologies, bilingual, bicultural method, total communication, a spoken methodology, and et cetera, et cetera.
Just to respond quickly, and then I'll allow for questions, but in framing the idea of total communication, I went through this in 1980s. I didn't practice it. I was already done with school at that time. It was the next generation that got hit, the next generation of deaf children going through primary school to be able to sign and speak at the same time. That's a total communication. And there's research proving that deaf children coming from homes that use sign language had an advantage over those that did not have a language. However, at that time, they weren't looking at the idea of ASL as a whole language, but a visual, like a visual form of English. So that's why they tried to overlap these signs in a way that was not natural to how American Sign Language is, but trying to force it into an English way. And that was for 30 or 40 years that has happened. The same thing with the Peace Corps person that you're talking about, that they spread that idea of total communication, which was appealing to a lot of people in the country. And it wasn't the idea of ASL was dominant, but it was really the idea of how ASL approximates English and how that was the primary concern there.
There are multiple strands that I can see, and there's a lot in the chat about how fascinating it is to hear about the activism, language policy, language ideology. A lot of our audience members are involved in multilingual education, and some of the same themes come up about whose language is valued, whose languaging practices, how they're integrated with identities. So we have a few questions coming through the chat as well, but if you have more questions, we're going to turn to our question and answer section. If you have more questions, you can put them in the chat. You can also use the raise your hand feature if you want to voice your question. So we will start off with one question, and then we will check the chat and look for raised hands for additional questions as well. One question we have is, just with intersectionality in mind, what are some of the facets of deaf history, language, or culture do you wish were taught more in K-12 schools? And either one of you can take that. And I put that question in the chat as well.
Erin?
Yeah, I think that we need more materials that are not around white deaf history, because unfortunately that has been the dominant paradigm that we have worked with. That's who's publishing, that's who's writing. It's white deaf people who are deaf of deaf. So now it seems as though there's more research, more data that's coming available. So we need more indications of a varied experience among the deaf community.
I completely agree. And to elaborate on that point just a little bit more, related to the idea of Black ASL, is now the research is out there and there's lots of materials out there now, and we're learning more and more about that. And what does that mean to have a dialect in American Sign Language? I will say that with further research and analysis, what we have found is, while there has been a separation, before the Civil War, there were no Black deaf schools at all. It wasn't until much later, the idea of segregation in the schools, again in the United States, built that separate way as well. There were teachers in the North that had moved to the South to sort of integrate schools, and ASL then started to disseminate in different states that started deaf schools, but they still, because Black children and white children were separated, there was still a problem there, and things have been overlooked. The idea of dialects was overlooked. White deaf ASL was the dominant language. That was the way what was taught in schools, and every state, has different dialects. Again, it's interesting that now we can talk about this, but that was never part of the conversation before.
That's fascinating. I also want to acknowledge a related comment in the chat about language variety and the intersectionality of language variety and identity. Petra in the chat offers that we also need to mention the Plains Indian Sign Language research as well, looking at the language varieties within the United States, and Erin, with your work globally, language varieties in the signed languages. Thank you for that comment in the chat. Erin, I think this might be a question that you may want to start us off on as well. How might calibrating as a stance be used to facilitate multilingual development within schools? So you're just thinking about, you said the calibration was a stance that people who use different signed languages were using to communicate and facilitate rapid language learning. Is there a way that you see that may be applicable for multilingual students in schools?
Yeah, I was actually hoping that someone was going to make that connection with my presentation and what's happening in education. So the reason why I love translanguaging and that philosophy is because how it decenters the boundaries of language. And deaf studies and researchers are working with multi-modalities. So it's really more about making understanding happen. and trying not to prioritize or deprioritize one language over another. And trying to move away from the idea of language as a boundary and the deficient framework of native language users. So if you don't fit the dominant society expected of what a typical language looks like, then you're viewed as deficient. And so trying to move away from that belief.
I would also add that within the framework of a heritage language, the expectation, and just the previous comment about dialects, that is explained historically for the immersion of dialects. Historically, looking at this, it was a dominant way, a prevalent way to get children to realize now that every child, in whatever location, they always face, having meet people with different signs and wanting more power and prestige, and sort of, stamping out another, or using that in sort of a societal status to oppress another language, but to really understand what's happening in general with language. And I mean, it applies with other languages, it applies to ASL, with spoken languages as well. Children, and enjoy learning, they honor the adults, but in American Sign Language, we do not honor the same, with grandchildren and then parents and then children, looking at their ways of communicating and honoring that. I hope that becomes more increasingly, people are understanding that idea of heritage language development comes from intergenerational passing along.
Great. Thank you for that. Anne, your hand is raised. Do you want to voice a question?
Yeah, thank you, Sabrina. Thank you both for these fascinating talks. Can you share a few thoughts on how educators in K through 12 settings, especially in public schools, can best serve their deaf students and families? And are there ways educators can highlight and build on the linguistic creativity of deaf students?
Just a quick comment. I have 2 grandchildren, 5 and 1. The 5-year-old, I'm concerned. I have 2 adult children, a daughter and a son. They married, my son married, had children, had 2 children, but things haven't really changed. Going to school, they brought home, signing, books, and they teach sign language in the schools, but how to do this? Looking at the home movies that I showed you, the first thing you need to do is have students visually engaged to understand. Deaf children have to look at each other. You have to look eye to eye. That's like number 1. My grandson doesn't even look at me. When I'm signing, I have to chase him to get his attention. So he didn't even learn that basic eye contact that is very important. And also getting attention physically, like tapping someone, touching them. If someone touches me on my shoulder, I'm going to look and see who's trying to get my attention. That's a basic deaf culture 101 type of thing. So teachers, parents of these deaf children need to understand that. I don't know if they know that or not.
Erin, did you want to add anything to that for that question?
No, that one's hard for me to answer. It's not my specialty. I don't focus in education. I'm an anthropologist. I think you really have to look at the child's sensory orientation, similar to what Ted has mentioned. If they're using visual practices or gestural practices and trying to support their multimodal language development in that way. And just be aware that deaf people experience the world in a different way. And the reason why is because their sensory orientation is different. So trying to support that as much as possible, I think, is the goal.
I also would like to add, in today's world, in general, societal expectations are that you put an interpreter in the classroom that's going to solve all your problems. So the teacher relies on the interpreter to take care of things, and all the information gets funneled through the interpreter to the deaf child. With American Sign Language, it's just thinking about a spinoff from total communication, having an interpreter being able to sign and speak at the same time. So you have person speaking, you have the signer that's behind the speaker, and then you got a child who's looking at a translation that's trying to be engaged, that may want to ask a question, that's always behind. So they're not on equal footing to participate in a classroom the same way. People think that an interpreted education and deaf education are the same. They are not the same. They are not the same. That you have to have a visual oriented curriculum for deaf children. You have to have smaller classrooms. You have to be able to seat yourself in a way that you're visually aligned. You can see everybody else in the room. There's dynamics that are very different because of visual language, but what we see is deaf children in the mainstream education, where they're around all hearing children and adults. Same thing in a medical situation. If deaf people have to go to the hospital or whatever it is, they're all in a hearing environment. So to understand what it means to have an accommodation, a reasonable accommodation, that's a pathological view of, it's looking at interpreters solving it and what the standards are, that spoken language is dominant, that's going to be the controlling factor, and other things will take care of themselves, that the interpreter will be there. It's almost like they're a machine, but there's no way to modulate. There's no way to have time in a spoken language environment to then create a visual orientation classroom or oriented classroom. So there's a conflict there. That's number one, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Ted. I agree with you completely. That also leads me to think about the question about calibration and using international sign, because the primary motivation with international sign is the labor that's involved of creating mutual understanding and connection with other people. That's a valuable investment in the relationship, and that is a direct relationship that's being created. So I think that teachers could borrow from that and think how they themselves as a teacher can calibrate to meet the child where they are. And that could be through gestural communication or whatever it takes to have a direct relationship with the child, rather than using technology or using an interpreter. Just like the guy who owns Streetcar 82, who rejects technology and forces that direct communication to happen.
wise and brilliant, I would say, sort of forcing calibration, but in a natural environment, ways that we already do that. So giving up the easy life, and it may be more difficult for some, but hopefully they're motivated, and younger deaf people being out in the world, meeting others and seeing what they can do, and looking at how sort of shifting society, walking into a bar that's all sign language based, this visually oriented bar. So how do you have people, want to do that, right? So, and the tour that you were talking about, the tour guide as well, how different dynamic that is.
I truly appreciate that an interpreted education and deaf education are not the same thing. And that calibration, one way might be to orient yourself to being invested in the communicative act, right? Like we are invested in making sure communication is happening. We have another question that Kayla raised in the chat. Kayla, I'm going to invite you to unmute and voice your question.
Yeah, one question that I had was when we're looking at the history of sign language and comparing that to the history of other dominant languages, I'm just wondering if that raises any implications for this view that sign language and just that's a deviation from the norm by kind of appealing to these normative uses of language, if that makes sense.
So you're talking about history, but I'm not quite sure what you mean by normative. Can you say that in a different way? You're saying that sign language is not considered normative?
No, I'm saying that I'm wondering if comparing it to oral, I'm not saying that it's not normative. I'm saying could that raise any implications for the view that sign language is a deviation from the norm by kind of appealing to English and the dominant modes of communication, if that makes sense, when we're looking at the history of different languages.
I see. In general, I would respond by saying humans will look at their experience and have that, they'll basically look at spoken languages. We all, have spoken languages as dominant language, so they would view that as being the normal, and that translanguaging, like looking at a play, say a mime in a play, right? You don't know anything, but they'll put through a mime, you'll be able to follow a story, like in Roman times. But that kind of went away. But the idea of what is normative is more recent, I believe, through imperialism and the use of privilege and oppression. And it relates to their need to suppress other cultures, white people trying to, what we've done to Native Americans in the United States, how we forced their ways of education in a different way. We have institutionalized them. And so trying to sort of looking at reframing this in terms of what's normative, that issue came up in the 20th century, not really in the 19th century. In the 19th century, sign language was accepted. There was oralism, it was not invented yet. It wasn't until the 20th century that that idea of speaking was better that then dominated. And then with the invention of hearing aids and things like that, they thought they'd be able to use technology to justify that, to have people learn how to hear as early as possible. that if deaf children can hear sound, and they'll be able to, speak, and it's using the use of technology, and how that determines language policy, and all of those, is sort of a domino effect from there.
Thank you. I know our time is getting short. I really want to appreciate Dr. Moriarty and Dr. Supalla for joining us tonight. I feel like we have been able to wrestle with linguistic oppression, privilege, colonialism, imperialism, and also the ways that it impacts the deaf community globally and domestically. And those are some of the same themes that we wrestle with in our programs, both in Georgetown, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. How do we work toward educational justice? How do we work toward transforming education spaces and actually transforming lives, that we are disrupting oppression, that we are pushing against colonialism, imperialism, and privilege, moving toward equity in all of our spaces. And our opportunity tonight to look at it with the intersectional lens through deaf identities, both nationally and globally, was very informative for everyone here. So we just really appreciate you being here with us and sharing your work with us and being able to engage us in these themes that cross all of our work and all of our areas of interest. So thank you very much. And we wish you all having a good night. Thank you.
And thank you so much for the invite. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful weekend, everyone.
Thank you.